We left off in our last video talking about the lobe-finned fishes and how they differ from the ray-finned fishes. We're going to continue with lobe-finned fish because lobe-finned fish are going to give us the tetrapod lineage. In other words, our tetrapods evolved from a specific type of lobe-finned fish. Now, we believe that they're evolved from this lobe-finned fish based on morphology, so similar characteristics and similar genetics. So looking at the genomes of some of these lobe-finned fish, there are similarities with other tetrapods. So part of the support for this is this transitional organism. And when we went over the fossil record in our evolution section, we talked about transitional organisms. Transitional organisms are organisms that basically provide a link between two different forms. And this fossil here, the Tiktaalik, it's called the Tiktaalik rosier. And the Tiktaalik rosier has some very specific features that suggest to us that it is a transition between a lobe-finned fish and an early amphibian. So we've got this ancestral lobe-finned fish. You can see the bone structure that we looked at in the very last video. If you don't remember that, you might want to pop back and look at your lecture notes. But there is an array of bones. We've got a larger bone in the back, a couple smaller ones, and then they sort of disperse into even smaller bones. Now, this bone structure was important because it allowed for what would eventually become a wrist and hand structure. Now, today there are all kinds of hand structures in our tetrapods, but if we look at early amphibians, we notice that there are analogous bones. We've got several different bone types that have counterparts way back in this transitional lobe-finned fish skeleton. Up here on the right, we've got some examples. You've probably seen this diagram before. This is an example of analogous structures in mammal forelimbs, and you may recognize that there are a variety of bones here in these forelimbs that are all analogous. That would have been back in our evolution chapter when we talked about evidence for evolution and homology, and also during our phylogeny chapters. But right now we're worried about the analogous bones in the lobe-finned fish for the early amphibians. So tetrapods are gnathosomes or jawed vertebrates that have 4 limbs. They colonized land about 365 million years ago. And if you recall, when we talked about plants and also when we talked about arthropods, there are a few things that organisms living on land have to overcome. One are adaptations for movement. Now, this is not important for plants, although dispersal is important for plants. But for arthropods, movement was really, really important. And arthropods evolved these complex jointed appendages and wings to help them move and diversify on land. In order for animals to move onto land, they had to figure out how to move on land. So fins and flippers don't work very well in dirt. And so they had to evolve characteristics that were going to allow them to do that. They also had to adapt their reproduction to a dry environment. So prior to this, as we saw with the chondrichthyans and some of our other fish, that reproduction is very much tied to the water, laying eggs in the water, fertilization in the water. So organisms on land also had to adapt internal fertilization in order to keep their gametes from drying out and their eggs from drying out. And they also needed some adaptations to prevent desiccation. So they needed things like a thicker skin, shells, etc. So the Tiktaalik rosier that we saw on the previous slide shows us that the lobe-finned fish with that special organization of their limbs was well adapted already for evolving a front forelimb that could support weight. So part of this sort of hefty, bony structure in the front is that it can support the weight of an organism. Whereas the ray-finned fish over here, with their rays coming from that small grouping of bones, can't support the weight of the organism. So there were a few things that we start to see in this tiktaalik. So we see a straighter vertebral column. And then we also see hip and shoulder bones that are braced against a backbone. So not only is there this sort of wrist and hand structure, but that structure is also supported and anchored to a backbone. If we take a closer look at the tiktaalik fossil, we'll notice a few fish-like characteristics and a few noticeably tetrapod characteristics. So the tiktaalik shows indications of scales, fins, and gills, which would indicate that it is very closely related to fish. But it also shows evidence of lungs. So we know that amphibians have lungs. They can breathe outside of water. Their early forms, their juvenile forms, have gills. So being able to breathe both in the water and out of the water would indicate that the tiktaalik spent some time in both environments. But then we see some definite tetrapod characteristics. For one, the neck can move separately from the rest of the back. Basically, it's got a flexible neck and spine. If you think about a fish moving through the water, they can't turn their head separate from their body. If they want to turn, their whole body turns, head and all. If they want to turn their head, their whole body turns behind them. They also have ribs that are similar to ribs in tetrapods, and they have that fin-like skeleton, fin and leg-like skeleton or hand-like skeleton in their fins. They have a flat skull. So think of like a crocodile who just kind of skims along the top of the water with just its nose and its eyes out and the rest of its body concealed underneath. This is the type of skull that this guy had, which suggests that it would have been in shallow waters peeking out. And so all of this taken together, we have some characteristics that make it both fish-like and early amphibian-like. So now we get to our early amphibians. In our amphibians, we see the first true tetrapods with 4 legs. So tetra means 4, pod means leg, or actually foot, leg or foot. So these are going to be organisms that have 4 feet. And most of these tetrapods are going to walk on all 4s, although we'll see some distinct variations as we move on. So amphibians have limbs and lungs that are adapted to a semi-terrestrial lifestyle. We say semi-terrestrial because many amphibians are tied to water, either spend most of their life in the water or have to return to the water to reproduce. So amphibians had moved to land, but just like early plants, were still tied to water for reproduction. So if you think about the amphibians that you know, like frogs, they lay their eggs in the water and they spend their juvenile form as a tadpole in the water, and they don't move out of the water until they metamorphosis into their adult form. So amphibians are still tied to water just like early plants were tied to water, like early mosses, because of their reproductive mechanisms. Amphibians did really, really well until the mid-Permian, which was around 300, 250 million years ago. And then many of them were wiped out during the Permian-Triassic extinction. This was one of the biggest extinction events that we've seen. The Permian extinction was one of the largest extinction events that we have seen. It was a mass extinction that was caused by volcanic eruptions in an area called the Siberian Traps. So this volcanic eruption released sulfur, carbon dioxide, and caused a massive increase in temperature due to the greenhouse effect. It also caused acidification of oceans, which all of this taken together caused an estimated 90% of marine species and 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species to be lost. This mass extinction was also the biggest hit that we've seen for insects, and every time there's a mass extinction event, it's going to shift the type of organisms that we see on Earth. But before we move on to our other organismal types, we need to cover a few key features of our amphibians. So amphibians have really thin skin. This is because they can absorb oxygen through their skin, but that thin skin means they're very vulnerable to drying out on land. And so we mostly find amphibians in moist habitats. Remember that they are often tied to water for reproduction anyway, and most amphibians' larval stages are aquatic, and they don't move out of their aquatic environment until their adult form. Amphibians usually reproduce by external fertilization. So the eggs are laid and then the males spread their sperm on top of the eggs for fertilization. Their young are develop in a shellless egg. So this is important because we're going to get to eggs with shells very, very quickly. And then, of course, we talked about metamorphosis, where amphibians have a juvenile form, and that juvenile form metamorphoses into the adult form. During the process of metamorphosis, the tail that we see on the juvenile is going to be reabsorbed into the body, as are the gills, and in their place, the organism produces limbs and lungs. Some examples of amphibians include frogs and toads, which are the most abundant order of amphibians. We also have salamanders and caecilians. The next group that we come to are the amniotes. These are tetrapods with a desiccation-resistant egg. So if you think about any animal that we haven't come to yet, it's probably an animal that is born out of an egg. This is going to include our reptiles, birds, and mammals. And the amniotic egg, or this desiccation-resistant egg, was the key factor that allowed animals to be completely removed from water. So just like we had seeds and pollen that allowed plants to become completely removed from water, the amniotic egg does the same thing. If you recall from seed plants, that seed contained an endosperm and an embryo, and that endosperm nourished the tiny little embryo inside. The amniotic egg is going to do the exact same thing. So the egg is fertilized, the embryo develops, and surrounding that embryo is a nutrient-rich substance that is going to sustain that organism until it hatches. So that amniotic egg is really what allowed animals to separate their reproduction and their early development from the water and avoid desiccation on land. So the amniotic egg would have been present in all of those reptiles, birds, and mammals. We'll see a couple of different versions of the amniotic egg, but all of the amniotic eggs are going to have a similar physiology. So starting in the center, we have the amnion that surrounds our little embryo here. So this light bluish purple sac around the embryo, and attached to that is the yolk sac. So this is the yellow part of our chicken eggs if you eat eggs for breakfast. And this is going to be where all of the nutrients are for this organism. So these are going to be the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins that this embryo needs to sustain itself and develop until it's large enough to hatch. Around the yolk and the embryo, we have the chorion, which is this light purple layer surrounding those regions. And then this sac structure called the allantois. Both the chorion and the allantois are important for gas exchange to allow the embryo to release carbon dioxide and to bring oxygen in. The egg is going to be permeable to oxygen, but not to water. And then outside of the chorion is the albumen. This is the light blue region here. This is the egg white part of our chicken egg. And that is going to basically provide a cushion and protection for everything inside the egg. So we see a few different forms of eggs. We see bird eggs, and you are probably all familiar with the bird egg. They're hard, calcium-rich shells on the outside that is there to protect the embryo on the inside. Reptiles and some mammals have more of a soft, leathery egg. Just depends on how they evolved. And then, of course, we are going to get to the placental mammals that are going to have eggs internal, so they aren't going to need that shell anymore. So the egg was not the only characteristic that allowed amniotes to move onto land away from water. They also had desiccation or have desiccation resistant skin. So our amphibians have really thin skin to allow for gas exchange, but our amniotes have thicker skin that is more water resistant. So your skin acts as a barrier to keep water in your body. It contains keratin, which is a structural protein, to kind of strengthen it and make it a little bit thicker. And related to that, we have gas exchange in our lungs. So amphibians can exchange gas through their skin, but our gas exchange in mammals and in other amniotes is isolated to the lungs. This is going to reduce the surface area that is exposed to the air that could dry out, but it's also going to be a very efficient organ for getting that oxygen into the body. And then we also have something called thoracic breathing. This is basically all of the muscles in your chest that coordinate to take big, deep breaths in and move your oxygen into your lungs, move that oxygen to the blood, and then the blood throughout your body. Amniotes also have water-conserving kidneys. This is important because it allows the body to retain as much water as possible before excretion. So the kidneys basically filter all of the liquids that go through your bodies, and they pull out any water that hasn't already been absorbed that the body needs, and then only release the waste that is no longer needed. And then, of course, amniotes have internal fertilization, which was another key innovation for separating these organisms from water. If fertilization is inside, then there's no risk of the egg or the sperm drying out